Okay, so welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing the hemostatic pathway. Okay, so we are in the process of discussing the coagulation process, and for this we're starting with the intrinsic coagulation cascade, which is activated by exposed collagen. So we've seen that exposed collagen is going to activate the conversion of factor 12 to factor 12A, or activated H-man factor, and then factor 12 in turn is then going to activate factor 11 into factor 11A. Factor 11A will then activate factor 9 into 9A, and 9A, once it's bound its cofactor, which is 8A, will then, that complex will then activate 10 to 10A. 10A will then form a complex with 5A, and that complex will then convert 2 to 2A, so prothrombin to thrombin. And now thrombin is the enzyme which then converts fibrinogen into fibrin. So it is then going, we're back up here basically, but in fact actually I'll just draw it out down here. So factor 2A is then going to convert fibrinogen, also known as factor 1, but more commonly now known as fibrinogen, again an inert component of the blood, and it's going to convert it into fibrin monomers. And then what's going to happen is that another enzyme, factor 13A, will convert fibrin monomers into fibrin strands, and then you're going to get these large webs of fibrin being formed. Okay, so this is how we're going to start producing fibrin strands, which are going to tie together the primary platelet plug and turn it into a secondary hemostatic plug. Okay, so the enzyme that does this is 13A. Right, so I also promised to tell you where factor 5A and factor 8A come from. So basically, when you've got thrombin, or factor 2A, what this does is it activates factor 8 and factor 5. So it's going to create both of these, basically. It's going to lead to the production of factor 8 and also the production of factor 5, okay? So, basically, what's going to happen is that when you activate all of this cascade and you get factor 9A, there will be a little bit of factor 8A initially in the blood. So it's not like there's absolutely none of this. There will be a tiny bit, and once the factor 9A is there, it will be able to bind with this tiny little bit of factor 8, and you'll get a tiny little bit of conversion of factor 10 to 10A. And it's the same with the factor 5A, so there'll be a tiny little bit of factor 5A initially, and the factor 10A can then bind to this and produce a tiny little bit of activation of prothrombin to thrombin. But then once you've got thrombin activated, it will then lead to the production of factor 8A and factor 5A here. Okay, so you'll then have much higher levels of this, and this will mean that this process can now proceed at much faster rates. So it's going to have a positive feedback effect, because once you've actually had a little bit of this thrombin being produced, it will then lead to the production of this 8A and 5A, which before were limiting this process basically, but now it's going to those levels are going to go up, and that's going to lead to this process occurring much faster, and you'll get much more thrombin being produced. So it will have a positive feedback effect in that way. Okay, so the overall result of this pathway is that exposed collagen leads to the production of fibrin strands, which are going to be intertwined within the platelet mass, and that's going to help strengthen that platelet mass and produces a secondary hemostatic plug. Now there is another pathway for activating coagulation known as the extrinsic coagulation pathway. So this is the intrinsic coagulation pathway, okay, and it's activated by collagen. Okay, so intrinsic pathway. We're now going to look at the extrinsic pathway, and this instead is activated by tissue factor, or factor 3. So we've seen long ago now, it seems, how platelets could be activated by both exposed collagen and tissue factor. So it seems very much so the same for the coagulation cascade. It can be activated both by exposed collagen and also by this tissue factor. And if you think about it, it makes sense because you need somehow something to be recognized. You need, when a cut occurs in the arteriole, you need something that's now exposed to be recognized. And these two things that are going to be recognized are the collagen and the tissue factor, which are not on the apical surface of the endothelial cells, and therefore the constituents of the blood would not usually see them. Okay, so let's discuss tissue factor. So basically, cells outside of the endothelial cells, so let's say this is a cell here, will have on their surface a protein known as tissue factor. Okay, so all cells in your body, except the apical surfaces of the endothelial cells, have this tissue factor, which is also known as factor 3 on their surface membranes. Okay, now when you get this cut in the wall of the blood vessel, then the blood can seep out into the other portions of the blood vessel wall, and in the other portions of the blood vessel wall you will have cells which have tissue factor on their surface. Okay, so you'll meet loads of fibroblasts and smooth muscle cells, all of which will have tissue factor on their surface. Now, tissue factor is going to activate another clotting factor within the blood. So in the blood there is another clotting factor known as factor 7. Okay, so here is factor 7 again in Roman numerals, and basically when it comes into contact with tissue factor, and by the way, factor 3 doesn't have an activated state, it's always active, so it's just a protein that's always in its active form. It would always activate 7 to 7A. It's just that it never usually sees 7 because 7's usually trapped within the lumen of the blood vessel and is not being exposed to any factor 3 because it's not on the apical surface of those endothelial cells. So factor 3 will now activate factor 7 to 7A when 7 is foolish enough to come anywhere near it. And that will happen when the blood is seeping out from the cut. It will meet cells with tissue factor on their surface, and 7 will be in that blood and will be activated to 7A. Now, what does 7 now do? 7 is going to activate factor 10 basically. Okay, so 7 will activate factor 10 to factor 10A. Just like we saw that factor 9 was capable of activating factor 10 to 10A, but we saw that factor 9A required factor 8A as a cofactor, remember? Oh no, it's not there. So basically here, factor 9A required 8A to bind to it, and the complex together were capable of activating 10 to 10A. 7 is capable of doing it alone, basically. It doesn't need a cofactor. So 7A will convert 10 to 10A, and then 10A, we know what this does. It combines with its cofactor, which is 5A. Okay, so here's 5A. And that complex of 10A with 5A is then capable of activating factor 2 to factor 2A, or prothrombin to thrombin. So 2 will go to 2A, and 2A's real name is thrombin. Okay, and factor 2, again, the name that you would usually hear people refer to factor 2 as, is prothrombin. Okay, and then we know what happens after this. Once you've activated thrombin, thrombin will then not only will it activate factor 5A, so it's going to have this positive feedback effect here as well, so it's going to raise the levels of 5A, but it will also convert factor 1 to 1A, so here comes 1, the proper name for which is fibrinogen. Okay, so this is fibrinogen, and it will activate it to fibrin, or factor 1A, fibrin, there we go, which is equal to 1A, and 1A will then be assembled into fibrin strands. So this will be assembled into fibrin strands. So here again, we are getting the production of fibrin strands. So this is the extrinsic pathway of coagulation. And you'll notice that it, unlike the intrinsic pathway, was activated by tissue factor rather than collagen. So it's another pathway for producing fibrin strands, but this time it's being activated by tissue factor rather than collagen. And this is the extrinsic coagulation cascade, or just the extrinsic pathway. So the big picture then is that when you expose collagen and tissue factor, what happens is this component of the blood, this inner component of the blood, fibrinogen, is activated into fibrin, and this fibrin is then assembled into fibrin strands. So you're getting these strands, these huge great protein strands being produced. Okay, now you've got to then plug everything together, because this will not be occurring on its own. It will be occurring whilst the platelets are all aggregating together. So you'll have a mixture of all these platelets aggregating together. That process is activated, we know, by the exposed collagen and the tissue factor. And at the same time, you'll be having this coagulation process, so you'll be producing these fibrin strands. So what you'll get is all this mass of platelets which are all aggregated together, and you'll also have strands intertwining in between them, and that structure is then known as a secondary hemostatic plug, and is a very strong structure basically, and that is what is going to block the side of the blood vessel which we have cut open. Okay, so that's a secondary hemostatic plug. So okay, the hemostatic response can be therefore divided into these three components. Firstly, you have vasoconstriction because of the release of the thromboxane A2 from the platelets. Okay, thromboxane A2 is an extremely powerful vasoconstrictor. Then you have the aggregation of the platelets into the primary platelet plug. Then you also have coagulation, where fibrinogen is converted into fibrin and then into fibrin strands, which produces these protein strands in amongst this mass of aggregated platelets, and that strengthens that mass of aggregated platelets to create us a secondary hemostatic plug. And that secondary hemostatic plug is then going to block the hole in the side of the blood vessel that you created. And this is the usual physiological response to breaking a hole in the side of the blood vessel.